And today we have Carolyn Willekes, who is the professor at Montreal University, and she will be talking about unicorns and narwhal tusks. So her topic today, or title for her today's talk, is "Here Be Unicorns, From Toot to Treasure." But I want to tell you just a little bit about what you will be hearing. So a popular creature of legend and lore, the unicorn has been imagined and interpreted in many ways from antiquity to the present day. The unicorn was not viewed as a creature of mere whimsy or fancy, as it carried much symbolic significance in both sacred and secular contexts. As a result, there was great demand for unicorn paraphernalia, with the most prized item being horn itself. So where did this horn come from? This talk will dive into the connections between mythology, religion, trade, and natural history to explore how the tooth of marine mammal could transform into one of the most expensive pieces of medieval naturalia as it journeyed from the waters of the Arctic Sea to the splendor of medieval courts. Carolyn Willekes is an assistant professor in the Department of General Education at Montreal University. She received her PhD from the Department of Greek and Roman Studies here at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on equines in ancient Mediterranean world, but also she has interest in the broader cultural perspectives of animals and the human-animal relations. So thank you all, and thank you especially Carolyn. I'm going to stop my share here.
Perfect. And I will.
Please show us your slides.
All right.
Wonderful.
So the phrase that we hear all the time now, can everyone see my slides? Okay, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. So I'm really excited to give this talk. It kind of grew out of a couple of things. So I teach a course at Montreal University in the Department of Gen Ed that looks at cultural perspectives towards animals, not just in the ancient world, but kind of throughout time. And how can you teach a class on cultural perspectives towards animals and not at some point talk about monsters and mythological beasts? And of course, I had to do, because I study equids, had to do a case study, or decide that I clearly had to do a case study on unicorns. So that's kind of what drove me into unicorn research, so to speak. And then when Marina and I were starting to look at objects and sort of develop ideas for our Money Zoo exhibit, I remember going into the vault in the Nickle galleries that Marina has, and walking in, and the first thing I saw sitting on a table was a narwhal tusk, and I was like, oh my goodness, you have a unicorn horn. And Marina's like, what? Like, it's a unicorn horn. And so then it was determined that I had to give a lecture on unicorns and unicorn horn trade. I will preface this by saying that I'm not a medievalist by training. I am sort of a classicist, ancient Mediterranean historian, but I am fascinated by mythological creatures, definitely by unicorns, and looking at the role that these imaginary beasts play in society and how their lore, their legend, the sort of natural history around them changes between different chronological and cultural contexts. So, first question, what is a unicorn? It seems a pretty straightforward question. I ask my students this question all the time, like, how would you explain a unicorn? And they reference things like magic and fantasy and mythology and kind of horse-like. So it's an animal that many of us are familiar with. I mean, it's incredibly popular in, well, pop culture. If you look at modern representations of unicorns, I mean, there's like a unicorn renaissance happening right now. The unicorn is so popular. You can get blow up unicorn suits that you can plow your sidewalk with, unicorn floaties. There's a person who makes unicorn horns that you can put on your horse. Like, you don't actually put it onto your horse on a brow band, but you can turn your horse into a unicorn. I think it was back in the 90s, the equine photographer Robert Varva produced this spectacular visual masterpiece, a book called Unicorns I Have Known, where he sort of transforms horses into unicorns, you can get yourself a unicorn onesie. And this is my friend Lonica. This is her epic unicorn coffee mug. I think it is probably the greatest mug in the history of mugdom. But this is like the modern sort of pop culture perception of the unicorn. We could talk about My Little Pony. And I have to say that the modern version of My Little Pony is very different from what I remember back in the 80s. You can even get unicorn hair, where like you dye your hair in different multicolored tones. And so there's a certain sort of set of semiotic cues that sort of reference the modern unicorn. But the unicorn is not a modern invention, nor is it solely a Western or sort of Western European idea. So to come back to the question of what is a unicorn, it entirely depends on who you ask. When you travel across the Eurasian worlds, you discover that in many different cultural traditions, there are references to single-horned land-dwelling beasts. And of course, this is something unique because most, well, all land-dwelling, horn-bearing animals typically are born with two horns or develop two horns, not one. So, certainly a unique feature of unicorn-type beasts in different mythological and cultural traditions is they do have the single horn. And so just some examples of other forms of unicorns are the qilin, which is the Chinese unicorn, and it's one of the most auspicious animals and sort of Chinese bestiaries. The karkadon, which is a Persian unicorn, it sort of comes out of Persian and Indian traditions. The kirin is the Japanese unicorn. The indrigzver, which is the Russian unicorn. The tahish, which is a South Arabian unicorn that kind of comes out of Yemen. And they all look a little bit different. But this fascination with one sort of mythological animals or extraordinary looking animals and animals that have unusual features is certainly something that we can trace across different traditions and different contexts. And there is a distinct interest in single horned animals, right? Which probably comes back to the idea that if an animal can have two horns, why can't it just have one horn? I mean, there are biological reasons why, but theoretically speaking, why couldn't it just have one? Which brings us to the question of sort of our relationship with mythological beasts or animals of the imagination. In the 21st century, I think, it can be easy to sit in our homes with our access to Google and Siri and 8 million things that we can do to fact check and find out what something is, if something is real or isn't real, and say, yeah, come on, like beliefs in unicorns and chimera and hydras and all sorts of monsters and mythological beasts. I mean, how could you think that those are real? But it really comes back to notions of perspective. And I love using this image and this sort of reference from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. So Alice meets a unicorn and both of them are completely stunned. Like they just stare at each other. Oh my God, you're real. And the unicorn says to Alice that he always thought that children were fabulous monsters, that they were imaginary, they were never real, that they weren't real because he'd never seen one before. And then Alice replies that she always believed unicorns were imaginary because she hadn't seen one before. So if we haven't seen something, if we don't have tangible proof that it does or doesn't exist, how can we truly determine whether it's real or whether it's imaginary? Especially in a pre-sort of internet Google search, that all the information of the world at our fingertips sort of existence. And so when we think back to the medieval period, think back to the ancient world and their associations, their ideas about mythological or monstrous beasts, the belief that these animals might have been real, their sort of like detailed descriptions of them, representations in art, we shouldn't see them as being like, how did they not know this wasn't real? In other words, until they see it or don't see it, how can you determine whether or not it's real? That's getting really philosophical. So let's go on to the next slide and I'll try and break it down a little bit more. So when we consider what a mythical beast is, or a monstrous beast, regardless of the cultural traditions, or regardless of the cultural construct in which it's being produced, or the cultural context in which it's being produced, there are specific requirements or specific elements that mythical beasts are going to have. Okay, yes, they're mythical. So that means that they are supernatural, mythical, or magical products of the imagination. We know that now. But in terms of sort of more pragmatic aspects, one thing we have to consider is where these creatures live. And for the most part, they belong to sort of imaginary or distant places. They live in the margins of the world, on the edges of the world. You're probably not going to find one if you walk down the street in your village or your city. They are in the furthest reaches of kind of the known human world. They often delineate spaces between kind of the inhabited, civilized human world and the chaos of the unknown, right? Places where you haven't been, where you sort of don't understand what's happening there. So they sort of are in these liminal spaces. And it's really important that they're in these sort of distant spaces on the margins of the known world, or the margins of what people might recognize, because it means that most people aren't going to see them, or most people would never presume to see them because they're not going to travel there, all right? So their geographical location on the edges of the human world is one key component in terms of why there was a believability around these animals. And the second one, and I find this so fascinating, is that these mythological creatures or monstrous creatures are made up of things that we recognize. I mean, if you stop and think about it, think about what a unicorn is, or a chimera is, or I mean, pick any sort of a phoenix, right? Pick any sort of mythological beast, and you can break down the components that make it up. In other words, it's made up of different parts of things that do exist, whether animals or plants or rocks and other objects. So we can dissect it. We can sort of visually look at it and be like, okay, like it's got some lion in it, and it's got some goat in it, and it's got some eagle in it, and lions and goats and eagles are all real. So theoretically, again, leaving the actual biology apart, you could get those three things together because the animals that make up this creature exist. If you see a monstrous or mythical beast where you can't recognize how it's made, what its components are, it instantly becomes less believable. So one of the key factors in creating a believable mythical creature like a unicorn is being able to recognize what made it, right? What parts of other animals have created the unicorn creature. And when we read descriptions of unicorns in ancient medieval texts, they're often trying to do this. They're saying, oh, it got some goats, or maybe some horse, or maybe some wild ass, or a bit of this. Like, they're making comparisons to animals they can recognize to try and place it in a particular sort of, I guess, biological context. And what they're doing is what these ancient medieval writers are doing when they're describing unicorns or describing other mythological animals isn't completely out of left field. Some accounts that we read of monstrous beasts or mythical beasts likely came about as a result of the individuals trying to describe something under tense and confusing circumstances, especially in unfamiliar landscapes. Again, today we have the luxury that if we see an animal that we don't recognize, we can take a picture of it with our phone and go, Siri, what is this? And Siri, or whatever app you're using, will tell you what species it is and where it lives and a bunch of random facts about it. That's a very recent development. Right? Until we had that technology, if you are seeing a completely unfamiliar animal that you cannot recognize, often our first step mentally is to try and figure out what looks familiar about it. So a great example I like to use is when the Europeans were colonizing and doing their thing in South Africa, they saw llamas for the first time, right? Llamas, alpacas are not native to Europe. They're not part of the indigenous flora and fauna. They come from the Americas. And so when writing home, they described the llama as a cross between a sheep and a donkey. And does it make it a shadonk or a deep? I'm not sure. We know that a llama is not a sheep or a donkey, nor a cross between a sheep and a donkey today. But when you see one of these for the first time and you think about it for a minute, yeah, you can see some sheepness to it. They're woolly. And of course, they're shorn for their wool to be woven into garments and things. And they've got big ears. They've got a bit of an attitude. You could see some donkey elements there as well. And so again, when we look at descriptions of what we know are mythological beasts, they're often looking or using descriptions or references to familiar animals to try and create a picture or an understanding of what this unfamiliar animal is. So there is some logic to it. Now, in terms of the earliest reference to the unicorn, and here I am gonna focus on sort of the story of the unicorn in the Western tradition. The earliest reference or literary reference, comes from Ctesias. So Ctesias was a Greek physician living in the 4th century BCE, and he spent some time working as a physician for the Achaemenids, so the Persian royal family. And while doing so, he was fascinated with all sorts of things about the world, sort of natural history and stuff like that. And so while he was at the Achaemenid court, he was no doubt getting stories. That the Persian Empire was quite large, stretched sort of across a large part of Asia. And so he's getting reports coming in from messengers and explorers and travelers and stuff like that about phenomena that they're seeing in different parts of the Persian Empire. And one of these is a unicorn. So he says that they're wild asses. They're as large as horses, some being even larger. He says the head is dark red, their eyes are blue, and the rest of their body is white. They have a horn on their forehead, a cubit in length. And this is really important. The filings of this horn, if given in a potion, are an antidote to poisonous drugs. And he goes on to talk about, again, also the sacred disease. So it seems to be a remedy for epilepsy as well, the filings from these horns. And he says the only way to capture them when they take their young to pasture. You must surround them with many men and horses. They will not desert their offspring and fight with horn, teeth, and heels. And they will kill many horses and men. They are themselves brought down by arrows and spears. So the animal he mostly seems to be describing here is the wild ass, Equus hemionus, probably Equus hemionus cur, the Indian wild ass. You can see sort of the red and white coloring. And honestly, I mean, if they've got big ears, so if you were to look at them in profile in a certain lighting, it might look like those big ears are just a single horn through an optical illusion. But sort of the biological side aside, there are two important things in this passage that are going to repeat themselves over and over again. The fact that the horn of the unicorn is an antidote to poison, and the fact that they are very difficult to catch. These are two key things. So Ctesias' account kind of becomes the foundation for other classical references to unicorns. So in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle also talks about them, and he uses some elements of Ctesias. In the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder, who wrote his natural history, he refers to them as a monoceros, and he says the body resembles a horse, the head a stag, the feet an elephant, the tail a boar. It has a deep bellow and a single black horn, 3 feet long, projecting from the middle of its forehead. And they say, again, here we see it again, they say that it is impossible to capture this animal alive. Aelian, who's writing in the 2nd century CE, he writes a bunch of stuff on animals. He makes several references to unicorns. He calls them a cartizan. So there's a bit of a different name, but other than that, you can see a lot of similarities to Ctesias' account and what you see in Aristotle and Pliny as well. And again, he makes comment on how difficult they are to catch. So there are two kind of foundational factors coming out of classical references to unicorns: the antidote to poison side of things, and they're very, very difficult to catch. You have to hunt them, and it's quite a complex thing to hunt them. And these two things are going to, in an interesting way, transmit themselves into medieval Europe. What's kind of fascinating about the unicorn or the cartizan or the monoceros, however it's referred to, in the classical world, is that it's not referenced very frequently. As far as I know, there are no classical images from classical art of unicorns. You only really hear about them in these sort of natural history texts. As far as Aesop's concerned, I think I've only come across one fable that seems to reference unicorns, the lion and the unicorn. They don't even really talk about them in medical texts, which is interesting given the sort of prophylactic qualities of the unicorn horn. And I mean, if you know anything about sort of the classical world, they're really into mythological beasts. So it's a bit of a curiosity that the unicorn isn't kind of more prevalent than it is. It's kind of a side interest that appears in these natural history texts. So how does the unicorn go from being kind of a side interest rabbit hole that some classical authors talk about when looking at aspects of natural history and phenomena to an immensely popular and influential animal? This happens in the European tradition, in the medieval period. And there are two reasons behind this. First, the unicorn appears in some translations of the Bible, the Old Testament. This goes back to the Septuagint, so one of the early Greek versions of the Old Testament. So the Hebrew Old Testament, in a few passages, and I can put the passages in the chat or mention them after if anyone's interested in the particulars, the Hebrew mentions an animal called a re'em. And so when the Old Testament was being translated from Hebrew into Greek, the translators were like, what the heck is a re'em? And the descriptions of this animal, like the passages in which it's referenced, make it very clear that this is a powerful animal, it's a horned animal, and it's not domesticated. So they're like, well, probably not an ox. And there is a passage where the ox and the re'em are mentioned in the same breath. Like, it's not that. And you know, these Greek translators would have been familiar with some of the natural history texts, and they clearly seem to be familiar with Ctesias. So it's like a few of them thought back and went, where have I come across a horned, strong, powerful, difficult to catch wild animal before? They go, the unicorn. And so the re'em in some versions gets translated as a unicorn. And as soon as unicorns are mentioned in the Bible, this becomes sufficient proof that they must exist and have incredibly important symbolic meaning as well. So that's kind of the first shift in the unicorn story. And then there's a text that emerges kind of in late antiquity called the Physiologus. And this is it's a natural history text, and it basically bridges the literary connection between the natural history texts of the classical world, like Pliny and Aristotle and Aelian and stuff, and the medieval texts that deal with animals and sort of natural phenomena known as the bestiaries. And so the description that appears in the Physiologus comes to shape the Western view of unicorns in the following centuries. So what does the Physiologus have to say about unicorns? It says that the monoceros, so mono is just another word for one, and ceros is horn, so one horned. So the monoceros, that is the unicorn, has this nature. He is a small animal like the kid, so goat-like, is exceedingly shrewd, and has one horn in the middle of his head. The hunter cannot approach him because he is extremely strong. How then do they catch the beast? Hunters place a chaste virgin before him. He bounds forth into her lap, and she warms and nourishes the animal and takes him into the palace of kings. The unicorn has one horn because the Savior said, I and the Father are one, John 10:30. So this is Physiologus entry 36. So here the unicorn is very clearly meant to be a representation of Jesus, the Virgin. It's most likely a representation of the Virgin Mary. The horn becomes a symbol of unity, or a reference to the unity, the connection between God and Jesus. And the unicorn symbolizes both the invincibility and humility of Christ, because in later versions, the unicorn will fight back. Unicorn does fight back. So that's kind of perceived as Jesus fighting against evil and sin and all of that. But the humility, the fact that it is captured, and as we'll see with the bestiary tradition, he usually is killed, dies, so sort of sacrifices himself. And the fact that he's small, he's like this little goat-like animal. So what we're starting to see with the Physiologus is clear sort of religious significance or symbolic significance appearing in the unicorn tradition. And the story as it's presented in the Physiologus is taken up by a very important set of medieval texts called the bestiaries. And they are accounts of the natural world. So most bestiary entries open with a description of kind of what the animal looks like, but their purpose isn't to provide a scientific analysis of the species, but rather to sort of explore the laws of nature and how each animal fits into aspects of Christian doctrine. So the animals in the bestiaries are given specific sort of motives and habits and characteristics that relate to the sinful human. So they reflect aspects of being human. And so they're meant to be a learning tool, right? Be like this animal, not like this animal. Act like this, not like that. So they're kind of a teaching tool to sort of find redemption and lead a less sinful life. And so the bestiaries then become a really important text within the medieval context. And the entry for the unicorn, which is longer, but it's in part verbatim for the Physiologus, and then it just adds a bit more detail in there, translate into the bestiaries. And this continues to support or promote the popularity and the importance of the unicorn in medieval society. All right, so the accounts of the unicorn that appear in the Physiologus in the bestiaries do two things. One, they link the unicorn to Christian symbolism through its connection to Jesus, and they also link the unicorn to the right to rule. If we go back to the previous slide, I don't know if I can do that. Oh, okay, well, the previous, yes, here we go. It says that, after the unicorn has been captured, I guess whether alive or dead, it is taken to the palace of kings. And there are references to this in the classical tradition as well, that Ctesias says that, right? When unicorns are caught, they are brought to the kings. They are displayed in the palaces and the courts of kings. So they are the prerogative of the elite, of the king. So the unicorn becomes a symbol of the right to rule, especially in the context of divine rule in Christian Europe. So this made the unicorn an important iconographic symbol. And here we see one of the very famous unicorn tapestries in the cloisters of the Met Museum. The unicorn here has been killed, which again is probably a metaphor for the crucifixion and Jesus dying on the cross. Here we see the unicorn being killed. Some people have read the stigmata into how he's being killed, and then the deceased unicorn being brought in on a very patient horse to be handed over to nobility or royalty. So these associations made the unicorn an important iconographic symbol, and that in turn created demand for products made from unicorns. It wasn't enough to just have unicorns on your coat of arms or things like that as sort of a symbol of heraldry. People wanted physical representations of unicorns. But we know that the unicorn, unicorn is a mythological beast. There's no unicorns wandering around the margins of the world. So where on earth do you find unicorn products to sell to the elites who want them? The answer is you go north, very far north. Leave mainland Europe and you head north to the Arctic Ocean. You find a very fascinating mammal, the narwhal. So the unicorn horns coveted by the churches and aristocrats of Europe to be placed in their treasuries or carved into objects or put on display were sourced not from unicorns, but from the narwhal, Monodon monoceros. So the narwhal is a species of toothed whale. It has teeth, lives in the waters of the Arctic Ocean. So it's very remote. They're not a particularly migratory species. They don't have like huge migrations that some other whale species follow. They can reach up to 17 feet in length, weighing up to 4,200 pounds. But of course, the most distinguishing feature of the narwhal is its tusk. This long spiraling tusk, they can grow up to 3 meters in length. The tusk is a tooth. So the narwhals kind of have two incisors, and one of those incisors can grow into this elongated tooth, typically found on males. On rare occasions, a narwhal can have double tusks, so 2 sets of these tusks projecting forwards. And really important about these tusks is the fact that they are spiraled, right? There's a spiral pattern to them. And this again goes back to the classical sources. Aelian specifically mentions that the horn of the unicorn is spiraled. So unfortunately for the poor narwhal, this made their tusks look remarkably like some early descriptions of unicorns. So when we're talking about unicorn horns that appear in the markets, the courts, the churches, the treasuries of medieval Europe, they are coming from not a land animal, not some goat-like or horse-like creature, but a kind of shy, medium-sized whale living in the Arctic Ocean. This, of course, meant you had to get the products from the Arctic Ocean to Europe, and they somehow had to undergo a transformation. So the main source for narwhals, for narwhal tusks, for narwhal products going into Western Europe was Greenland. 2 particular regions. Hopefully you can see my my cursor, but Baffin Bay here, and then the Cane Basin, which is sort of up here next to Thule. I won't try to say the indigenous name. So I mean, these are remote locations. Even now, it's hard to get there. Like, you're not just gonna like traipse over to Baffin Bay or the Cane Basin. It's a climate of extremes. The tusks probably entered through Norse traders. So by the Middle Ages, there are Norse settlements on Greenland. there's some debate as to whether the Norse themselves were the ones hunting the whales and other Arctic mammals. So there's also tusk walrus ivory that's being sourced in the Arctic Ocean as well, and polar bears. So there's question as to whether the Norse themselves were the ones doing the hunting. Given the short span of the hunting season, I think they hunted them sort of during the summer, and the remote location, it's more likely, and the difficulty, I mean, medieval whaling was a very dangerous occupation. It's more likely that the traders got them from the Inuit. And so they sourced the tusks from the Inuit, and from there, the tusks were brought across Greenland and entered the trade route across the Atlantic. And there's some argument that this demand for products that came from animals in the Arctic Ocean was one of the things that drove Atlantic trade. So they then went through routes that connected Greenland to Iceland, the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. And basically, as soon as these narwhal tusks left the Arctic, as soon as they were removed from the narwhal, which of course requires killing the narwhal, and they left Greenland, crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and entered the European market, they are transformed from the tusk of a really unique whale into something even more rare, expensive, and exotic. And I should point out that there was never a huge number of tusks being sourced. They are difficult to get. So there was always a bit of a shortage of them, that they could never probably meet the demand. So this drove up the price. We don't know exactly what the prices were, but they would have been expensive. And so owning a unicorn horn or things made from unicorn horns was the prerogative of they were found in churches and cathedrals, but also in private collections belonging to very wealthy individuals. So part of the thing that's allowing this is just the economy of the Middle Ages. The economy of the late Middle Ages, there's more exploration happening, more travel. So people are going closer to those, further reaches of the known world, where these imaginary or these fantastical beasts are supposed to live, and they bring back accounts of it. Because again, even they may not be seeing an actual unicorn or an actual chimera or something, but they're seeing animals they don't recognize. So just like the Europeans in South America with their sheep donkey for a llama, right? These travelers, these merchants who are sort of pushing the boundaries of where they're going in the world to source products are seeing animals that they don't know what they are as a species. So they're trying to describe them, and there are unicorn type animals that they reference. They bring back accounts of these extraordinary creatures. Also objects sourced from these creatures. So in some cases, they're bringing back live animals like Barbary apes and stuff like that the wealthy add to their menageries. But there's also a demand for products, secondary products made from these animals. And this is where unicorn horns fit in. So the narwhal tusks, once they enter the market and arrive in Europe, are immediately transformed into unicorns. They become highly valued ecclesiastical and seigneurial artifacts. And just to give you an idea, like in 2015, there was in an auction house in Norway, this double-tusked narwhal skull was put up for auction, and the price estimates ran between $95,000 and $150,000 Canadian. So they're still highly valued items, and they certainly would have been in medieval Europe as well. So they're transformed into unicorn horns, and then they come to sort of fill a couple of different purposes. One, we do find them in ecclesiastical contexts. So sometimes in the treasuries of churches and cathedrals, they could be used as ceremonial artifacts, particularly processional staff. So we see a 12th century example here that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This one's a really unusual example. There's another one in the World Museum in Liverpool, which is quite similar to this because it's elaborately carved. So it's not just the horn itself that's sort of carrying the symbolic significance and the beauty and the prestige, but it's decorated as well. So it's kind of going through a supply chain. So it's about 1.7 meters long. The lower portion depicts humans sort of in foliage, sort of trapped in foliage. And then the upper portion shows dragons hunting animals. There are other examples. So there aren't a lot of actual narwhal tusks that survive, and they can be hard to date, but we do have records of sort of treasuries and accounts. So we know that other cathedrals and churches had unicorn horns that weren't carved, but would be sort of bedecked with gold and silver or other precious metals put on display. So these are prominent potent, powerful, symbolic objects because of their connection to Jesus and the symbolic representation of Jesus through the unicorn in the Physiologus and the bestiaries. But we also see them in secular contexts because, again, the unicorn represented the right to rule. So this is the Einkunschwert. It's the unicorn sword of Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy. I think he was the last Duke of Burgundy. So it's made in the 15th century. It's a steel sword, but the pommel, the hilt, and the scabbard are set with unicorn horn, narwhal tusk. So, and you can still see the spiral pattern. That's kind of important because the spiral, there's symbolic significance to that as well. So it represented Charles's right to rule, his power, his authority. It was inherited by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and then eventually ended up in the treasury in Vienna, and now it's in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna as well. But again, we're seeing unicorn horn being used as like a prized object. The royal throne of Denmark is sometimes called the unicorn throne, and for good reason. So it was completed around 1671. And it was or is the physical representation of the throne and kingdom of Denmark. For a long time, it was the anointing throne. This is where you were anointed as king. And it's called the unicorn throne because the spokes on it and then the legs are made of unicorn horns. So they're made of narwhal tusks. And the king of Denmark would have access to unicorn population, both through, or not the unicorn population, narwhal populations, both through Greenland and at points in time, Norway and stuff as well. So he would have had a source of narwhals at his disposal. And I mean, by the time we get into the 17th century, people are starting to be a little more suspicious, like this is sort of rationalization and logic appearing and sort of, thinking about things from a scientific, logical manner. And they're like, are these unicorns that we've never really seen a live unicorn? We've seen other exotic animals, but not a live unicorn. So there's a bit of intellectual suspicion emerging about the existence of unicorns, but the idea of the unicorn still carries power, both in the religious and secular sense. So even though when this throne was crafted, the royal family and stuff of Denmark isn't probably thinking that there are real unicorns up there prancing around in the woods. It's the notion of the unicorn. It's what the unicorn represents at a cultural level that is important. A third important feature attached to the unicorn is the horn's ability to detect poison or neutralize poison. So again, this goes back to Ctesias. He mentions that, right? That if you put the shavings of the unicorn horn in sort of liquid, it will, eliminate any issue from poison, or that cups could be carved from unicorn horn, again, to neutralize any poison that might be used. So complete unicorn horns become objects of place-setting objects on tables for elites, for aristocrats, for rulers, because of course, poison was used to kill people. And if you are really high up in society and you have a prominent position and you have enemies, there is probably in the back of your mind a very real concern that someone might try to poison you. So yes, you have food tasters and things like that. But it seems like the unicorn horn becomes the preferred method for determining whether or not your food and drink has been poisoned. So again, our friend Charles the Bold of Burgundy, there are accounts of a couple of dinner parties he threw where he had, I think one time 4 complete unicorn horns and another time 6 complete unicorn horns set up on at sort of the corners of the table in different places. And the way that they were supposed to detect poison was if there was poison in their presence, they would start sweating. And the notion that they can neutralize poison. So if you put the horn in the poisoned object, that the poison will then become ineffective. And again, this is found in some literary traditions. The Carcharodon, the Persian unicorn, also has this ability. So there's possibly a bit of a cultural conversation going on there. And we see it in this unicorn tapestry, the series of tapestries. So this is one of them. The unicorn purifies the water. And this is similar to the reference that we see about the Carcharodon, where the unicorn dips his horn into a watering hole that has been poisoned, so the other animals won't drink from it. He dips his horn in there, and then the poison is neutralized, and the animals can drink from the water again. So you could have complete unicorn horns on your dining table. You could also have objects made from unicorn horn, and these would be used, you would dip them sort of into the cup or into the liquid to try and neutralize the poison. Or one thing that this object, the Danny jewel. So it's a cross section of narwhal tusk of unicorn horn that's been set in a gold pendant. So you would have it at the table with you, so you could dip it into your food or dip it into the liquid, but the back of the pendant is scratched. And so the argument made is around that is that people would, the owner would scratch bits of the tusk off the back of the horn, make a powder, and then sprinkle that in their drink or in their food to try and neutralize poison. So unicorn horns then became a highly prized and highly valued object. They reflect sort of international trade routes and transatlantic trade routes that are happening. They reflect the degree of exploration that is happening in medieval Europe, but they also show the powerful symbolic significance of these mythological animals, even when we get to the point where there's some suspicion about whether or not they're actually real. And I had to put this quote in because I love it, because what happens when you've sort of been raised on stories of unicorns, you know, the unicorns of the bestiaries and the ones that you see in medieval art and the tapestries and aquamanils and coats of arms, and you happen to be an explorer yourself, heading off to the far reaches of the known world, someone like, say, Marco Polo. So in book 6 of his travels, Marco Polo encounters a unicorn, and he is completely baffled and I think a bit upset about what he saw. He says, "They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant's. They have a single large black horn in the middle of their forehead. They have a head like a boar's and always carry it stooped towards the ground. They spend their time by preference wallowing in mud and slime. They are very ugly to look at. They are not at all such as we describe them when we relate that they let themselves be captured by virgins." So Marco Polo has been raised with a very specific image of what a unicorn is supposed to look like. It's this sort of regal, elegant, powerful being, and he's over in Sumatra and he sees something very different. Of course, what he's describing is a Sumatran rhino. This is a young one. I had to put this picture in because it's perfect, because this is a young Sumatran rhino that has clearly just been wallowing in the mud. So we can imagine Marco Polo picturing the medieval Western European unicorn and seeing this. So yeah, we'll finish there with poor befuddled Marco. The idea of the abstract and the reality, the imaginary and, you know, our logic. And I leave you with the elusive sighting of the dozercorn, because yes, in the modern world, you can even turn your dog into a unicorn. Thank you very much.